We all make mistakes in our gardens. It's part of it. It's how we learn. And mistakes are not something that I want us to shy away from and think that we've got to do it all perfectly, because frankly, that's not possible. And the sooner we realize that, the happier we're going to be with our garden, and we'll be able to go with the flow a little bit better. If you're a regular listener, you know that I try not to shy away from my mistakes. Even now, 12, 13 years in, I try to tell you what mistakes I've made and what I've learned. And if you're new to the Beginner's Garden podcast, I hope that you will appreciate that, because I think transparency helps encourage all of us. But there's one thing that I notice year after year, and that is that between beginners and even some of us who have had experience, we all seem to make sometimes the same mistakes. And what I want to do in this episode today is to talk to you about 5 mistakes that I've identified that I feel like are very common in gardening. And sometimes it takes hearing these, even if we've had experience, to realize, oh, that's why that happened. I know I learned so much from other gardeners myself. So today, whether you are a brand new gardener or you've been gardening for a while, I hope that you will learn something today, because as gardeners, we don't quit learning. And the best part is learning from each other. Let's talk about 5 common gardening mistakes that I feel like are greatly overlooked. And if we can recognize and avoid them, then I think we're going to have better success. Number 1 is something that if you are a regular listener, you have probably heard ad nauseum and you're sick of me talking about it, but it never fails. Every spring, I continue to see this over and over. So I'm just going to keep shouting it from the rooftops, but I'll try to make it brief for those of you guys who have heard it a million times from me. And that is thinking that your zone informs when you plant. If you're new, a garden zone, a USDA garden zone, if you're in the US, tells you what the average minimum temperature in the winter is. It is used to make decisions on what you want to plant as far as perennial crops go, those crops that will last your winters. But they are not meant to tell you when to plant your crops in the spring. Now, you may be asking me, but Jill, I just saw something from my county extension office that says, here's what you should plant in zone such and such at this time. And I've had that question too, but when I've seen these, and I'm not sure if it was from my extension service or something else, but when I've seen these charts for Arkansas, where I live, I was able to understand why even the planting by zones locally can be fairly accurate. And I think it's because if I'm looking at Arkansas, which is, in my geographical area, I think we have 3 zones, maybe from 6 to 8, from north to south. Well, those zones in particular do roughly correspond with average last frost dates. So someone in zone 6 in northwest Arkansas is going to have a later frost date than those who are in zone 8 in southern Arkansas. And you can just kind of picture, if you can picture the state, how that goes. And so I would say if your local county extension service, your local university is putting something out like that, then most likely they are just saying zones that make it easier to comprehend, because it's a lot easier to say, well, I'm in zone this and I'm in zone this, and when should I plant? Then, okay, let me calculate that average last frost date. That's a little bit more of a step, even though it's not hard, but understand that you're not truly planting spring crops by zone. So that is one thing that we want to know, is that when we try to find out when we should plant our crops, whether it's a cool season crop or a warm season crop, and we're going to talk about that more in the next episode, then we want to know our frost dates, our average last frost date in the spring, our average first frost date in the fall. And for some of us, especially those of us that get hot weather in the south or wherever, is when do we get temperatures above 85? Because that will indicate also when we need to get some crops harvested. There'll be more on that to come. So if that's confusing, hang in there. I'll eventually get to that in the next few weeks. Also, when you look at task lists of when to plant, and whether that's by zone or whether that's by your average last frost date, when it comes time to actually plant, we need to be mindful of weather conditions. This is something I talked about more in depth in last week's podcast episode, but just because my average last frost date is, say, April 1st, and just because I put on my calendar that I'm going to plant tomatoes on April 8th because I want to be more conservative, doesn't mean that I'm actually going to plant them on April 8th. If the temperatures at night are still in the low 40s, then I'm a little nervous that we might have a frost, and low 40s aren't good for tomatoes anyway. And so I may delay it when it actually comes time. So the calculations that we're doing now, early in the season, are more just to be ready to plant. On the opposite end, and you heard me talk about this last week, sometimes I plant crops earlier than what I had put in my calendar because we are getting warmer quicker. The example was peppers. Usually I don't plant peppers till the beginning of May. Last year we started getting warm pretty rapidly, and I could see from the long range forecast that it'd probably be good to go ahead and plant peppers a little earlier. They did just fine. So all that to say, when we actually plant, we're going to have to be smart about looking at the weather and considering the plant when we actually plant. The when to plant charts are all for our planning purposes and just making sure the plants are ready, more so than the calendar says I plant now. I've got to do it no matter what. Okay, so number one is to truly understand how to figure out the timing of when we're going to plant certain things. Number two, and this is what I'm going to talk about for a little bit longer because it has been something that probably came to me over the years, and I've been realizing its importance more and more, and I'm still learning, but that is not realizing the importance of sun. Now, I know that sounds obvious because we all learned in elementary school that plants need sun to grow, but it becomes an issue, especially when I field questions from gardeners of what can I plant in the shade, which is a fair question. Or my garden has morning sun or afternoon sun, or maybe things will be okay even if I don't get a lot of sun. And what I have seen in my garden is sun makes way more of a difference than I ever realized in lots of different ways. So let me explain to you a little bit why sun makes a difference, especially in our garden plants, our garden vegetables. First, back to what we learned in elementary school, just a little bit of a refresh. Plants make their own food. Okay, so we don't, obviously we have to consume, but plants make their own food, but they still have to have ingredients. And sunlight is the key ingredient to making that food. The leaves of our plants act like solar panels, and so they are soaking up the sunlight. And inside the leaves, we have chlorophyll. You remember that vocabulary word from 5th grade science class. And what that chlorophyll does is it helps the plant mix sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide from the air to create the plant's food, which is a sugar. Don't you like they get to make their own sugar and actually grow and not have health consequences? Kind of jealous of plants, right? But all of this happens, this photosynthesis happens to create sugar, which becomes the plant's food. Photosynthesis. That's the whole process of photosynthesis. So if we know that the plant needs air and the plant needs water and the plant needs sun, if the plant doesn't get enough sunlight, then they can't make enough food to grow. So I haven't been in science class for a really long time. So I hope that all that was accurate and understandable enough, but it's one of those things that I know intuitively, but actually sitting down and think about, oh, okay, so that really is part of the process of the plant growing. I know maybe it's silly, but it took me a little bit to really understand that. But going back to someone who may be asking, what can I grow in partial sun or part shade? You've probably heard that some crops don't require as much light. The term that I've heard and that I've shared with you on this podcast is if a crop has a fruit or if it grows a root, such as like a potato or a carrot, then it needs full sun. But if it's grown for its leaves, it can tolerate part shade. But why? And that's a question I've really never asked. I've always just taken it as fact. But there are some crops like lettuce that need less light than others, like tomatoes. and why. And I will tell you that we are going to get more in depth into this in the next podcast episode. So we're going to dive a little bit more into the science. But for now, with the sunlight, it's all about the energy needs. Lettuce and greens, anything that's growing for the leaf, they're like light eaters. They only need a little bit of food to grow, and they are growing these soft, leafy parts. Makes sense, right? They're not growing to 6 feet, right? They're not growing a whole lot. So they require less energy, and so they require less sunlight. They've also adapted over the years to grow in shady spots, and they've also adapted to grow in cooler seasons. And if you think about cooler seasons, your spring and in your fall, your day length is shorter and the intensity of the sunlight is less, and they've adapted to be able to thrive there. But as we compare that to tomatoes and peppers, compare a lettuce plant to a full-grown tomato plant. They are big eaters. They need lots of energy to grow their fruit, which takes more time and more effort. They also need a lot of energy to grow deep roots. And we're going to talk about this too in the next podcast episode. I'm so excited to share this with you, but I'm not going to get ahead of myself. But the whole point of this is because they need more energy, they need more sunlight. So right now, when you're doing your garden planning and you're deciding on garden placement, sun is important. And one thing that I will continue to share with you is that when those of us who are in the Northern Hemisphere, the south is best. When we're looking at sunlight, the southern exposure is going to be the most sun. Those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, I know I've got some Australian gardeners, you're in the middle of your summer and you're seeing this firsthand. Obviously, north is going to be your ideal. But you may be asking me, Jill, okay, I live in Texas. What about us? Because we get really, really hot. Well, in hot climates, hot temperate climates, not tropical climates, but in hot temperate climates, when we get temperatures over 90 degrees, sometimes even sun-loving crops like tomatoes and peppers can benefit from shade to avoid heat stress. Now, the heat stress is something that's a whole other subject. We'll talk about that later. But a lot of times what gardeners will do to help with that heat stress, because it's a for sure real thing, is that we'll put shade cloth over even the tomatoes, even the peppers to help with that heat stress. So then you're probably asking, like I was, okay, well, if they need a whole lot of sunlight, then what are we doing shading it, right? Well, the thing is that usually when they're under this heat stress, we are talking about the middle of the summer when we have the longest days and the high intensity of the sunlight. And so still with a shade cloth, they're going to get enough light for photosynthesis. These plants will take advantage of early morning and late afternoon, especially if we have, like, a lot of times when I'm putting the shade cloth, I'm not like totally putting it on, but I'll put it where it may block the afternoon shade, but they still get full morning sun. But if we do that, it will make efficient use of the light that they're going to get. And don't forget, shade cloth doesn't block all the light out. It just filters it. So they're still getting light from that shade cloth. So by reducing stress from extreme heat, the plants can use the light that they do receive more effectively. And that's another thing, is if the plant is under stress, all of its mechanisms are going to be hampered. But if we can reduce the stress that the plant is under, then it's going to be able to take in that light and use it better as compared to being really stressed and having all of that sun and heat on them. That's a lot to talk about regarding sunlight, and we're going to talk more about this in the next episode, which, by the way, is going to be on Friday. We've done this for the past several years, and you guys have really enjoyed it. Just because I know you are wanting more garden information this time of year as you're planning, we're going to be doing bonus Friday episodes, and this Friday we'll be talking more in depth about cool season crops and warm season crops and why some are cool and why some are hot. And we're gonna dive into some subjects that I have always wanted to know about, and to me it's fascinating. It will help you also make some decisions in your garden. So be sure you're subscribed, and you'll get that episode on Friday. Okay, so that was all about sun and how important it is to consider sun. And if you are dealing with shady conditions, then okay, what crops are going to thrive in the shade? They're going to be the crops that don't require as much energy, right? So that kind of makes sense and would make you be able to make a better a better judgment call on, okay, I have this part shade, which crop would thrive better? Well, now you know, well, which ones require more energy or less energy, and it might help you make a better decision on what to plant there. Moving on to number 3 is, and this is something that I see from lots of beginning gardeners, most veteran gardeners have either learned this the hard way or they don't struggle with it anymore because we know, because we've seen the results, is a lot of times beginners consider soil as an afterthought. I know I did. My first garden, I was like, okay, let's just till it up and plant everything in the ground, or let's just find some cheap bags of soil, or, you know, those bags that say raised bed soil mix or whatever, and put it in the raised bed and everything will go great because, I mean, what does it matter? We just have to grow in something, right? But not necessarily. And those of us who have had gardens for a long time have seen the results of having good soil versus having not so good soil. And this is the time of year, I know, that we're so tempted to think about what are we going to plant and when we're going to plant, and then maybe where is our garden going to be. But we also need to take this time of year to think about, what is the condition of my soil? If you have a ground bed, I mentioned this in last week's episode, and you have no idea what the pH of that soil is, I recommend that you get a soil test. Do you deal with clay? Do you deal with rocks in your ground bed? Those are really hard to work with. Of course, I've had clay in my ground bed for years. It can be amended. It takes time, but you need to know what you're working with. Many people just till and plant. That's what I did my first year, and I'll tell you, it'll work. A lot of people do that, but what I see more often than not is those that are beginning and they just till and plant. Number one, they deal with a lot of weeds because they haven't prepared and they haven't mulched right away, like after they plant, and then they're fighting weeds the whole season. It's exhausting. And then you get discouraged because you can't keep it up. But another thing is that sometimes, not always, it depends on the quality of your soil, the pH and all of that. Sometimes nothing really grows very well and they don't understand why. And again, a soil test is helpful. Now, if you are growing in raised beds, I do have episodes on how to fill raised beds and then also refreshing the old ones, and we'll put the links to those in the show notes. But here are some tips that I'll give you on that, whether you're filling for the first time or whether you're refreshing the old ones, is find quality compost and topsoil. Most raised beds that are actually all the raised beds that I have grown, with the exception of one time I tried the Mel's mix, which was the square foot gardening mix, and it was just fine. But besides that, most of the raised beds that I've ever done are some kind of a combination of topsoil and compost. And you'll get more information on that in one of the episodes that we'll link. But find quality topsoil and compost. That is not always easy. And a lot of it depends on what you have access to in your location. So here's the number one thing I would suggest that you do, especially if you don't know of a good quality source, is ask local gardeners for suggestions. This is easier than ever. Even if you're a brand new gardener, find a local gardening group. I know we have one on Facebook for gardening, or for Arkansas gardening, and I know there's lots of gardening groups online. And then you can ask them, say, hey, I live in this city. Where can I find good quality soil for my raised beds? And then most of the time people are going to ask you. I have a lot of people that ask me this that know me locally, and I tell them exactly where I get my soil. The thing is that when we gardeners find a good source of soil, we are glad to tell you about it, because we know that if you don't get good soil, you're not going to get a good crop most of the time. And I prefer, and I've talked to you guys about this before, I prefer buying bulk compost and bulk topsoil, but because I have a large garden space and it's cheaper because I buy it by the cubic yard. A lot of times we have it delivered. Sometimes we go get it ourselves with my husband's truck and trailer, but that may not be an option for you. So bagged soil may be your only option, especially if you have a small space. And again, I would still ask people locally. Because in my town, we have local nurseries and we have Lowe's. But like if somebody had a great thing at Home Depot, we would have to go 45 minutes away to get something from Home Depot. So ask people local, have you found a bagged soil mix that works well in your raised beds? And I would definitely recommend you ask, because I have bought soil from Lowe's in the past, that a particular brand that just never worked well for me. And a lot of the times, it was, and I also bought some from Home Depot one time, but all that to say, a lot of it was because I was just buying the cheapest thing possible. And so with soil, I would recommend taking the extra step and asking people where to get quality soil rather than rolling the dice. Because I talk to gardeners every year that are so frustrated because they bought a particular kind of soil and their crops didn't grow. And so they eventually get a soil test and they realize that it's deficient. Or what I sometimes find is that they buy bagged topsoil and it's got a lot of bark content. This has happened to me. And bark isn't bad for your garden, but if it's not broken down completely, it will rob nitrogen while it's breaking down. So that first year, you could possibly have a poor result and you don't know what's wrong. The next year will probably be fine because the bark will have broken down. But you don't know that because you just bought a bagged soil that you didn't know any different. And so that's why I think asking questions is something I would highly recommend. Now, if you're a container gardener, this gets a little bit easier because most of the time you're just going to buy a potting mix. You would decide whether you want to do organic or do non-organic. Again, you can ask others. A lot of people do that, especially Facebook groups. My Facebook group with my Dream to Garden members, they will ask potting soils for the green stock. And green stock specifically recommends a couple of different potting mixes for that. There's fewer options there and less room to go wrong when you're talking about container mixes because they're going to be generally soil-less mixes. But still, ask others. And the last thing that I want to leave you with on considering the soil is, and this is something that I have learned over the years, focus more on the soil and less on what fertilizer do I need. I honestly rarely use fertilizers in my raised beds and in my ground beds because I focus on high quality soil to begin with in my raised beds and high quality compost when I am topping off every year with compost. I rarely fertilize. And so a lot of people will say, well, what's the best fertilizer for this? And what's the best fertilizer for that? I don't typically use fertilizer because I don't have to, because I start with good quality compost and soil. Now, I do use Organic Rev, the organic growth stimulant, but I use that mostly when I'm seed starting, transplanting, and sometimes when I'm watering, especially in high heat. But that's not to feed the plants. That's to help the plants be able to access the nutrients that are already there in the soil that I know is good quality soil. If you focus then more on the soil and having higher quality soil, you're not going to have to spend a lot of money on fertilizer or remember to fertilize. That's something that with my containers, I always forget to do regularly is fertilize. And I can't imagine if I had to remember that for my raised beds. Start at the foundation and I think you'll be so much happier. I just wanted to take a quick break and invite you to my free live workshop. You may have heard me talk about it already. The Productive Gardener's Blueprint, happening next week. In just 1 hour, you'll gain the tools that you need to create a garden that works with you and maximizes your harvest. Here's an example of a few things you'll learn. The most common planting mistakes and how to avoid them for better results. 2 surprising climate factors that once you know them, this will transform your success. And easy succession planting techniques. I'm going to give you exact examples from my garden to help keep your garden producing longer. And this is something I can't wait to share with you. New this year, you are going to learn a powerful new strategy I just discovered that will cut your garden planning time and stress significantly. And forgive the cliche, but this is a game changer. This workshop will be packed with practical advice and strategies that I have refined over the 12 plus years of my gardening so you can get results in a fraction of the time. Now here's where the fun begins. You'll get a lot of great information in this class, but when you register, whether you come live or whether you watch the replay, you'll automatically be entered to win a big giveaway with prizes from Greenstock Gardens, Garden in Minutes, Epic Gardening, and others, whether you attend live or watch the replay. But when you attend live, we will also be giving away additional prizes throughout the class from some of those same partners. And not only that, live attendees will receive a free gift from Organic Rev. So you've heard me talk about Organic Rev. They're going to be giving something away to those of you who are there live. No purchase necessary. This is such a popular class every year that we are offering it at 4 times so that you can pick the time that's best for you. And we have 2 times on February 18th on a Tuesday and Thursday, February 20th. So you can pick the time that works best for you. Now the replay will also be available for a couple of weeks after this class. So if you're listening to this after the live classes are over, then you can still watch the replay. To sign up and grab your seat, go to journeywithjill.net/masterclass and choose the time that works for you. But we do have limited seating in each class, and sometimes those classes have filled up, especially the earliest ones. So make sure that you sign up today. I can't wait to see you there. Mistake number 5 is planting crops too close together. You may have heard the phrase intensive planting, and yes, it sounds great. More plants in the same space, more crops. And yes, this can be true, especially in raised beds. We can get so much more out of our garden space than you think and than the seed packets. But I still make the mistake of planting crops too close together because it is so easy to do when they're small. The thing is that it's often a temptation when we especially start from seed indoors. This is especially a temptation. Overplanted the seeds in order to be able to have the ones that we need, and then they all end up germinating, and then we can't get rid of them because they're baby plants, and then all of a sudden we have more than we have garden space for. This is what happens to me every year, but especially happened last year with my fall broccoli, and I'm like, what am I going to do with these? So I decided, okay, let's just plant them all closer. Anybody ever been there? Well, this is definitely a temptation, but the problem is when we plant our crops too close together, they get crowded and they compete with light, water, and other nutrients. And what this does is that it leads to stunted growth and increased risks of diseases. And we think that we're getting more product because we've got more plants, but a lot of times we end up getting less because they are struggling to be able to access what they need. The thing is with our plant spacing is that we want to go for that Goldilocks distance, not too far away because then we've got too much sun hitting the soil and weeds pop up. And plus, it's not efficient use of water and other things, but we don't want them too close either because they will compete. What we want to do is think about what is the mature size of a crop. And we want those leaves to just barely touch, but not really overlap a whole lot. Now, obviously, that's going to be kind of an estimation when you're planning and when you're planting. I've had some crops that, don't get as big as they're purported to get, and I've got some that just grow really large. But for the most part, you want to aim where those crops are just barely touching. They have this canopy so they can prevent light from getting to the weeds down below if you're not properly mulched. But all this to say is that we want to be mindful of what that mature size is when we plant the small plant. Now, this does apply when you are growing one crop, whether that's a bunch of broccoli in a row like I did this year, or with companion plantings. So you want to be careful with companion plantings too. If you're planting 2 different kinds, it's possible to get those too close together to each other too, but for different reasons. Let me give you a couple of examples from my garden this year. You may have heard me talk about how I had a particular eggplant that didn't do so well. And the reason I realized was because it was shaded by other plants that were around it. I had planted celery on both sides of it. Well, the celery I planted way earlier than the eggplant, so it had grown really tall, but it started shading the eggplant when the eggplant was really small. So the eggplant needed a little bit more room not to be shaded. Now, the problem here was that I actually had the plant spacing correct. I had them about every 12 inches, which is about right for both eggplant and celery, but I didn't consider the shading factor. Another example was my broccoli. Again, I planted them too close. Now they all did fine. I ended up having a really good harvest, but the heads themselves weren't as large as a couple of broccoli that I stuck in a different bed that didn't have any competition whatsoever. And so what we'll find is that when we give crops just a little bit more space, depending on the crop, is sometimes they'll end up yielding more than if we are trying to pack them together. And mistake number 5 is choosing the wrong crops for your climate or season. Beginners sometimes plant crops that don't thrive in their region or in their season, like trying to grow cool season lettuce in the heat of summer if you live in the South. I talk to beginning gardeners a lot who plant their lettuce at the same time as their tomatoes, and that's just not going to work out very well in Arkansas. So understanding that some crops thrive earlier in cooler weather and some crops thrive later and even into the heat of summer is going to make a big difference in your garden. It's really important to understand that not all of your crops will grow at the same time, even though you might want to go buy it all at one go at the garden center, especially if you are a new gardener. When you do that, and if you do that, that's fine, but make sure that you're going and you're buying your warm season crops all at the same time, and that your cool season crops, either you skip them for the spring or you go earlier and get those cool season crops and plant them. Because there is a difference in how crops grow in cool weather in the spring, in warm weather, in hot weather, and even in really cold weather, and those that don't. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode on Friday. Is we're going to dive really deep into that, because I think not only is it important for you to understand, okay, here are the categories and here are your cool season crops and here are your warm season crops, but more than that, why? Let's talk about why. And it will help us to make better decisions on what we plant and when, and even how we try to stretch the seasons and when we cover and when we don't. Knowing the why will make a big difference. And I can't wait to share this with you on Friday's episode of the podcast. So make sure you're subscribed to that, and we'll dive into that on Friday. And hopefully, maybe you'll get a nice February weekend out in the garden and you can put your earbuds in and listen while you're gardening. I would love that. But before you go, let me remind you to sign up for the Productive Gardener's Blueprint Live Workshop. It's free, and we're hosting it 4 different times, February 18th and February 20th. That's next week. So grab your seat, sign up, enter to win those amazing giveaways, and I hope to see you there. journeywithjill.net/masterclass. And I can't wait to share all this with you. We've got a lot of great stuff coming up, and I am with you in it. I can't wait for you to start growing your garden. I'll chat with you again on Friday.